Hey there. So for the tens, if not hundreds of Studio HFL fans, I'd like to say hello, welcome back. I would like to let you know that I've got some more interviews finally coming out. In 2017, I started these interviews. First 50 or so were audio only. And then, of course, thanks to COVID and Zoom, I was able to get video for most of the rest of these interviews. And then life went back to somewhat normal and I stopped editing, and it's been bugging me for some time. So finally, the pendulum has swung the other direction, and here I am finally editing and getting these interviews out. If during the interview you are so moved to like and subscribe, then please do. Don't worry, this is my only ask. You won't see or hear about that again. So now, without further ado, on with the interview. Brooks, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Well, you too.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny, the email that you sent. I didn't see it until this morning, and of course, then we traded a couple there. But yeah, this started out. My whole focus was trumpet players, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm a trumpet player,
Right.
and even then, the focus there was it was going to be all about pedagogy, all about who studied with who and teaching and all that, and that evolved very quickly into something. It's just become conversations with people. And, at some point I'm thinking, I got to interview somebody other than trumpet players. But I was still in the brass world, right? So I'm still interviewing horn and trombone and tuba players. And then it hit me mainly because I had been asked to turn this into a radio show.
Huh.
And I thought, okay, if I do that, how much of that audience is actually going to be interested just in brass players?
Right.
So now, it's supposed to be, it's a music slot for this. And so I thought, oh, okay, I got to start reaching out and branching out. So no, I think this is a great opportunity. I've interviewed a guy named Greg Wing who had toured with Buddy Rich. And so I've gotten a little insight to a famous drummer. Of course, I'm familiar with Louis Bellson and Max Roach and Ed Shaughnessy. I was just watching some of the Johnny Carson stuff this morning and, Doc's band. But no, to get an opportunity to talk to somebody from, I don't want to say the other side of the tracks because it doesn't sound that great.
Different department. That's what.
Yeah. There we go. So yeah, I'm glad to have you here, and we're not live. And don't worry if there's anything we need to edit out.
Okay.
I'm happy to do that. So
keep my minimum.
So tell me a little bit about yourself. Like what are your career has been, is going to be, and all of that.
Yeah. We could start with the is going to be. That one's pretty much shot at this point.
Right.
I've been a full-time musician band leader since the 9th grade. And I'll be turning 67 in November. So that's a long time. Of course, out of necessity in this country, having to do a lot of other work in the meantime to support that habit.
Right.
But I've actually been exclusively full-time since about 1977. Also had to teach myself how to be a house painter. It's amazing how many musicians are really good house painters too. And their houses look like crap,
Right.
And I decided in 79 that I was sick of a lot of the road stuff that I was doing, like 8-hour trips in a Chevy van from, Columbia, North Carolina or South Carolina, all the way up to Stanhope, New Jersey.
Oh man.
Yeah. With a bunch of people I really didn't like. So I said, to hell with it. I'm going to start my own band, because what I grew up loving since I was, as far back as I can remember, was the Goodman quartet. So that was my idea, was to model a band after the quartet. And of course, the first guy I talked to was a guitar player. So all of a sudden it was the Goodman sextet. Okay. All right. And it just sort of grew from there. Went through a number of generations of players that their hearts were in the right place, but, we weren't on the same plane, basically.
Sure.
Achieved a lot of sort of regional success with the band, met a lot of great players, many of whom live up there in that, in that COVID hotspot up there.
Yeah.
And are still good friends. So, and of course, some of those were trumpet players. I think my first trumpet player that everybody just absolutely loved, and rightfully so, now retired, went back home to Defiance or Alliance, Ohio. Classical player as well. I remember listening to him doing Haydn pieces and so forth. He loved playing lead trumpet. His name was Clyde Hunt, or Dr. Clyde Hunt. They all have doctor on there somewhere.
I got to look that name up. Yeah.
Well, Clyde is great, but it'll be hard to find him because he's probably one of the most self-effacing guys I've ever known, but could truly, truly play his instrument, he's the one who introduced me to people like Maurice Andre. He really opened up a lot of musical doors. He was also a great guy. I talk about him like he's dead. He's not. But what he was not a jazz player. So he would construct solos in the band and not carefully, not rigidly, but he would play them pretty much the same way every time. But they were such great solos, who cared? What he didn't really like doing was playing in a big band that often, and by the time he finished teaching and retired from that. So a lot of other changes. And I've worked with some tremendous brass players, tremendous musicians in general. I have my favorites, of course. I have those I don't like at all. But a lot of that was pretty much opinion shaped by either working with them or their recorded output. I got a kick out of your interview with Liesl. She's played in my band a number of times.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. Liesl's great.
Yeah.
But her counterpart locally in the Army is Kenny McGee. And if you haven't talked to Kenny, I highly recommend it.
All right.
He's probably the finest, for me, he's the finest lead player I've ever worked with. Also a good guy.
Yeah.
But not a jerk, And there are lead players who are, in my opinion, fit that bill.
There are a lot of trumpet players that, that stereotype came from somewhere, right?
Right.
So, and some of them unfortunately still live up to that, but not very many anymore, which is
well,
great.
It's interesting. I've often wondered why, because I mean, my musical sphere of influence goes back from the late 20s, and perfectly blunt, I sort of lose interest somewhere around the late 1950s. I look at the Goodman trumpet section of 36 and 37 that had their own nickname. They were called the Biting Brass of Harry James, Ziggy Ellman, and Chris Griffin. And I don't seem to ever remember any conversation about the lead player having some massive ego, because all three of them would play lead at one time or another and blow the windows out of the joint. So I don't know where that came from. I have a feeling it came from the later bands. And I hate to say it, but possibly the bands that were spawned by people like Maynard.
Well, I was just going to say, you look back at those early bands, it wasn't all about high notes. It was about the swing.
Right.
Right. And so, with Maynard and Stan Kenton, and you've got those bands coming along where that lead trumpet player really is kind of the high note guy. Right. I can see what you're talking about, that change over that division from, the Goodman, the Dorsey, even Louis Armstrong was not a high note guy. Right. And it's all
right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because the Goodman trumpet section, they had a running thing going between the three of them, that if they did not memorize their part the first day the chart was put in front of them, they owed the other two $1. And of course, no one ever transferred any dollars. These guys would end up and play these complicated figures with memorizing them. So the whole standard of what was excellence was, I think, a little different. Plus, there was this whole thing about power. My guitar player for 8 years was a dear friend, Steve Jordan, who worked with Freddie Slack, and he worked with Artie Shaw, and he worked with Benny Goodman. He also worked in Maynard's band Kenton's band for a short while. And Steve was a strictly acoustic rhythm guitar player, played a Gibson L5. For that gig, he had to pull out the big one, he called it, which was a Super 400, where the body depth was twice as deep as an L5. The idea being that it projects a louder sound. And he said he was at the first rehearsal, and knowing that there were 5 trumpets behind him, he thought it was going to be interesting. But he said when those trumpets stood up and played, he said it almost physically knocked him out of his chair. And he turned around and it was only 3 of the 5.
Wow.
So the whole power thing started getting in there. Anyway, I could go on about that for
Yeah.
ages.
Yeah.
But Kenny's a great player.
Yeah.
As far as big band playing, I would choose Kenny over anybody else nationwide.
Yeah. Wow.
So
It's quite an endorsement.
if you haven't had a chance to talk to Kenny, it's worth doing.
Yeah. So just to clarify for those listening that are going to be listening, you're behind the kit when you're talking about leading the band. You're not up front. You're like Buddy, right? Or King Krupa or the others. I mean, you're driving the bus from the kit over there.
Absolutely. And it's a good way to put it, because a lot of band leaders who are instrumentalists of horns or whatever, piano, they hate that idea. They hate the idea that the minute that tune starts, the drummer is leading the band. I love the idea, of course.
Of course.
So yeah, and I remember when a tenor sax player was in my band for a while, young guy then, named Harry Allen. The first gig we played together, he turned around after the set and said, "Wow, you really lead a band well from behind the drums." I didn't think I was really doing that much other than the musical leading. Okay. But I was also at that time pointing out people to solo in the middle of a tune. I was doing the things that you normally see the front line do. So, okay, maybe that's what he meant. Harry's a tremendous, tremendous sax player. And with guys like Harry, you didn't really have to do much, except, make sure that it didn't fall into just abysmal chaos, which it had that potential at times. So yeah, that's what I do. I still do, and I have the chance. I haven't had the chance.
You mentioned you were really brought up on the bands of the 20s, 30s, 40s,
right?
Maybe early 50s. But who specifically caught your ear?
Well, my hero since I was 5 is Gene Krupa, and for me, everything stems from that. But it's mostly because Gene, aside from being a phenomenal player, he was a real musician player. He was a very melodic drummer. He was a thoughtful drummer. He also kept things in context and was not interested in just waiting for his opportunity to show everything he could play. I mean, his famous quote is, even the super chief has to slow down once in a while. And yeah, it was a period when most of the musicians that were playing jazz were playing in dance band. And, there were tempos that were not that easy to dance to. So yeah, he is my primary influence, to the point where I'm just now finishing up a book, because another focus of mine is vintage drums, and specifically the brand of drums that Gene used his entire career. So I guess you could call it an obsession. I don't know, and I love the fact that his probably one of, if not his dearest friend, was Roy Eldridge.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Roy was the one who stepped in many times in the 40s to take over running the band if Gene couldn't be there. And one of my favorite framed photographs is a shot of the two of them just looking at each other straight in the eye, shaking hands. It's just a beautiful, beautiful picture.
Yeah.
And then the influences of other drummers sort of leached in after that. Not so much Buddy, because I just don't have that ability in any way other than hopefully to at least do my job, set things up, mark things where they need to be. But I'm not going to be yelling at anybody or throwing sticks at them. I didn't have his level of wit. So sure, a couple of other people.
So you're talking about Gene Krupa and this book. What are you writing about? I mean, is his life? Did you know him? Are these anecdotes? Are these stories from other people or personal experience? What's the perspective on that?
All of the above. It's not a biography per se, but in order to explain it. The primary focus of the book is Gene's equipment history from beginning to end. In order to explain some of that and try to explain some of Gene's decision making and choices, it becomes biographical. It also, by default, becomes sort of a brief history of the Slingerland Drum Company, who also made bugles, by the way. So it's all of those things. It's some of my passion about the man and what a crappy deal he got so often in life, and how he managed to be such a great human being in spite of that. But also the fact that he had an unprecedented endorsement deal with Slingerland that started, nobody knows, somewhere between 1930 and 1935, that he stuck with, honored till the day he died.
Wow.
And didn't bounce around looking for the best deal. You know, he and Henry Heenan Slingerland sat down and worked it out, and Gene said, okay, I'm your man. And he was his man until October of 1973. So, wow. I mean, he was, to me, the man himself was profound. What he did was profound, how he played, et cetera, et cetera. The fact that everybody loved him, except those who were intimidated by it. Unfortunately for him, many of those were jazz critics, jazz, quote, scholars. Oh, well, it's all about his showmanship. What a bunch of baloney. You know, I mean, that was the way Gene played, physically, period. It was not something that he sat in a little room in front of a mirror and said, this will look good. Because people who talked about recording with him since the 30s in the studio, what would be the point of doing all that nonsense when the only people there are going to be the other musicians? He did it that way because that's the only way he could. So, but this is, again, it's like our friend Ricky Riccardi has been on a quest to dispel a lot of the stupidness about Louis that continues to this day. I'm the same way with Gene.
Mm-hmm.
And
you mentioned that, you know, it's just this morning I read a Facebook post by Ricky talking about he's already gotten his first negative criticism on the book that just came out. And, but his take on it was, you know, look, I knew it was coming.
Right.
And it's like, look, it's like food critics. It's like any kind of critic. I think they're there just for their own self-pleasure, right?
I would agree. Yeah.
And it's like, what's the point?
Yeah.
You know, the people who should critique the book are the ones who buy it and read it for themselves. I mean, that's the only really critique that matters, right?
Absolutely. Which luckily we sort of have that vehicle now these days with the internet that we didn't used to have. And the fact that, you know, again, Gene, it comes back to Gene again. Gene was quoted as saying once, when somebody said, how is it you can stand to be raked across the coals by these people? Gene's response was, well, you know, critics have to eat too. He was that kind of guy that even something, I mean, and some of these things were pretty nasty. I don't think they got to the level of nastiness that they got to with Louis, but they were some pretty cutting stuff. I mean, a lot of his, quote, fan base immediately turned on him in 1943 because of, you know, a horrible, terribly done frame-up drug bug. That he was acquitted and exonerated of all charges. He never did what he was accused of doing, but bless his heart, being a man of honor and being unfortunately honorable, he still spent 84 days in jail for something he wasn't guilty of. So anyway,
so he's got a lot of critics, but I mean, you know, of course, nobody pays attention to the good stuff that comes out, right? I mean, it's criticism, the negative, that really garners all the attention.
Of course.
So, what were they saying that was detracting? I mean, was it? Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of what they could have said.
I can tell you, I had alluded to it a little bit. The biggest complaints that the critics, the negative critics, would have was that it was all showmanship.
Oh, right.
And it, you know, that all of this stuff really had nothing to do with serious music, which of course is complete and utter nonsense in Gene's case. And yet, why do they not evaluate on the same thing with people like Ellington? I mean, some of the most showmanship flourishes of somebody's body I've ever seen in my life. Or Woody when he stuck his clarinet up in the air. Or even Artie Shaw. I mean, judge everyone equally. Don't pick out the things that you think are a flaw with one guy and then turn around and not even mention it with 50 others. It had a lot to do with the fact that the guy who's on top is always going to be the easiest target. So he got pot shots all the time. Of course, when the 40s rolled around, the war ended, the whole focus of jazz was starting to shift. Well, like Louis, he might as well have, walked away then, because whatever Gene was doing that was laudable was going to be shoved under the rug as just not being hip and relevant anymore. Okay, Gene came from a different place. Gene continued and will continue to be one of the greats, if not the greatest, long after the Max Roaches and the Art Blakey's are gone. Long after people start going, wait a minute, Gene's doing some of that stuff back there in 1939, isn't he? What is this thing about Kenny Clark being the birth of the ride cymbal? What a bunch of nonsense. I've got plenty of recordings of Gene doing that in 1935 or earlier, and a lot of other drummers, of course. But we all know how those campaigns go. A lot of people just love the idea they love to peddle the idea that Gene never had an original thought in his life musically, and that everything Gene did was attributable to somebody else. What a bunch of garbage. But it's a popular thing to do because people like to look at these things as sporting events,
Right.
Well, my guy can do this because blah, 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 which you can't really do with music. So anyway.
You look back to where, well, when did he first really come on the scene? What year or decade?
1927.
So what was setting him apart? You mentioned how musically he played, but what set him apart really from the styles that had been acceptable up to that point?
Well, his influences at that point were, of course, Baby Dodge. He was based in Chicago. And he names them often. Tubby Hall was another one. And some of his peers, like George Wettling and Dave Tuff, Gene was like a sponge. He was described that way by a number of his buddies. He would soak up anything that had to do with drumming. But his idea was that he was building his musical lexicon, building that library so that he could then use it like any horn player, any piano player, when he thought it was appropriate. And it was not just a matter of, okay, I have a job to do as the drummer, so I'll sit back here and do my job. No, man, I'm going to play this song with the rest of you bums. And I'm going to express myself creatively just like you do. Well, this was a big deal for those who liked it, really scary for those who didn't, which were usually band leaders. Because he was very expressive in the way he played. That came out in things that were, for some, a little surprising. Cross-stick accents in places that people never heard them. Rhythm patterns that were his own creation, cannot be attributed to anyone else. Ideas that he had about how to use cymbal. I mean, it's a very long list of things that Gene did.
So that prompts the question, you think about, these were not Neil Peart Rush type kits, right? Where you're surrounded by drums. And Neil, by the way, I think, rest in peace, I think what a terrific musician.
Neil was a great player, right?
Yeah. And I'm thinking about, okay, what I think of the teens and the 20s of the 1900s, right? We're in the teens and 20s of this century now,
right.
But when I see videos of this, it's like you see a snare, a kick, and a cymbal. I mean, there's not much going on there
Well,
on stage, right?
right. A lot of that has to do with how the recording industry was developing, A, and B, the different regional accents of what was going on. If you look at a drum set that Sonny Greer had in 1929, he spent close to $3,000 for that stuff. But it's everything straight out of the Leedy catalog: timpani, vibes, gongs, orchestra bells. It was like, I'm going to put everything I own up on this bandstand, and I might use a third of it. That's pretty much where, unfortunately, we are these days. Gene came from Chicago, and as he said, it was more raw, and he was interviewed once in New York in the 30s by Joseph Mitchell, who was a beloved columnist up there who, had a particular style to his interviews, oftentimes a little bit fanciful. Anyway, he interviewed him, and Gene said, I knock all that stuff off. And what he's talking about is, I don't need tempo blocks, trap trays, junk, bells, whistles, because I come from Chicago, and what I need is a bass drum, a snare drum, a cymbal, and a cowbell, and I'm fine.
But that's amazing that you can do so much with so little.
Yeah. Well, again, it had to do with how you did it, how musical you were. Everything that the drummers like George Beebe and Chauncey Morehouse used up there in your neck of the woods was mostly oriented towards playing shows and big Whiteman Goldcat-esque orchestras, and you had to basically be prepared to do anything and everything, including bird whistles. Mm-hmm. Well, Gene's upbringing had nothing to do with any of that. Although he was always impressed by what people did with it, he didn't need any of that stuff, His musical conversation, he had all of the materials he needed right in front of him. In the recording industry, remember, this was not an industry that was that old. So a recording engineer is not going to have a clue how to record a set of drums with tempo blocks and all that rot. They all of a sudden became the musical directors. And they say, here, one choke cymbal, pair of sticks, maybe a snare drum with a blanket thrown over top of it. Knock yourself out. And of course, I've been jazz scholars for decades that have said, well, you're playing that wrong because that's not the way that recording from 1927 sounds. Well, so that was also evolving at the same time. In the studio, you were lucky to have a choke cymbal to play on the backbeat or offbeats, whatever. Of course, you go out on the live stage and, you've got this fortress of percussion equipment. Mm-hmm. You're going to want to use it. So Gene didn't need that.
Would you classify, I look at Buddy Rich kind of the same way. He didn't seem to have a whole lot of just drum set in front of him. And, even, I don't know, I look even in the later years and with the big bands, right? It's still bare minimum. Yeah. What I consider bare minimum. Did Gene remain that way through his career?
He did. I mean, the set that you see Buddy playing was basically Gene's idea 10 years earlier. Gene, another one of those precedents that Gene set that has been forgotten is because Gene was so hugely popular, starting around 1935, 36, basically everything he did and everything he used, everybody had to have the same thing or something similar. So yeah, it was a basic kit set. I don't use the word kit usually because I'm old. And it involves, of course, the keystone of any drum set is the snare drum. And then the bass drum and whatever tom-toms you add to it, most people just went for what they saw Gene using, which was a 9x13 on the mounted tom, a 16x16 on the first floor tom, a lot of people get this wrong. Gene did not use two floor toms when he was with Benny. That didn't start until 38 when he left Goodman and started his own band. But the second floor tom was a monster, 16 by 20. And that's all he ever needed. The only difference is when Buddy put together his first Radio King set, that's the kind of Slingerland drums they all used, he opted for two floor tom-toms of the same size instead of one and then a bigger one. And that's the way Buddy used it for all of his career. 16 by 16s, two floor, single mounted bass drum, usually bigger than most people are comfortable with. And interestingly, Buddy's last set was a restored set of Slingerland Radio King drum with a 26-inch bass drum, which people would run away from in horror because they thought it was too big. Buddy wanted a 28. He was trying to get a 28 to match the set, because this is a guy who grew up starting to play drums when he was 4 years old. He knew what drums are all about. So, and that drum set actually is at the Smithsonian.
Wow.
So,
well, you talk about Gene playing with the Goodman band. How long was he with that, and who had he played with? Any other bands of note prior to that?
Of note, probably not in the jazz world. He played with most of the bands that he played with in and out of Chicago were just put together bands, or he was backing up a singer. When Ian Condon finally moved to New York permanently, his greatest claim to fame was that Red Nichols loved his playing and managed to get him into the pit orchestra for one of Gershwin's shows. And Gershwin immediately fell in love with him and loved what he did. And everybody else started paying attention to what Gene was doing. But Gene, from Chicago, lots of kids in his family. Their father died when Gene was 7 years old. This was a work ethic family. Gene needed to make money. So he played with a whole bunch of bands, Irving Aronson, Buddy Rogers, and the one that probably was the most well-known was Mal Hallett. And Hallett, of course, was this giant of a man who, would stand there in a posed picture with his band and look like some science experiment where he's just towering over all. Anyway, when Gene joined Benny, he'd already played with Benny several times and frankly, didn't really like him that much.
Oh.
It was difficult, from what I understand, to like
the music person or the person.
He loved the music. He didn't really think much of Benny.
Oh.
So he joined with some level of resistance. But by the same token, he loved what Benny was doing and what he was all about. And he was playing with Buddy Rogers at that point, who was doing this ridiculous, I play every instrument in the band thing. And Gene got sick of it and said, if Buddy Rogers picks up one more instrument, I'm out of there. And that night he did. He joined Benny at the end of 1934 and left him in March of 1938. But he did so much for the Goodman band in that period of time and was so completely dedicated to Benny's whole idea that many in that band said Gene worked twice as hard as Benny did for the band. And you can see it, how it works that way. He just put his absolute heart and soul in it.
So when he went off to start his own band after leaving Goodman, was it the same style band, and was he writing his own charts, or what?
No, he was not writing his own charts. He had his own musical ideas that he would get someone to put on paper now and then. Actually, one of his biggest hits was written by Roy Eldridge called Rareback. They changed the title to Drumming Man. But it was similar to what a lot of the, up and coming swing bands are doing. And the focus was initially more on Gene's soloing. And he didn't really like that much. but he didn't really zero in on the quintessential band until 41. So from April of 38 until, I forget the exact date, but early in 41, he was doing pretty well. People loved his band. They loved what the band was doing. Irene Day was the vocalist. The couple other featured things, but nothing really monumental.
Mhm.
In 41, he had all of a sudden a regular guy in the band who also happened to be a black guy. And this was not a featured star. This was a guy who was in the trumpet section. And it was, of course, Roy Eldridge. Because Gene said, what would you think about playing with my band, Roy? And Roy said, sure, I'd love to. So there it was. 41, in walks Anita ODay. And that was the combination that put them into the way top echelon of popularity.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, his date book just went berserk. Not to say he wasn't busy before that, because a lot of people did love it. But yeah, initial kind of, slow start. But by 41, just really stepped on the gas pedal and went zooming along.
So how long did that stay intact?
That stayed intact until he was framed for drugs in 43. He was set up by the feds. There's an extensive piece that a guy named Dennis Brown did that lays out all of the details about what a ridiculously bad job they did trying to frame Gene. But it really cut him deeply, really deeply. And all he wanted to do is go back home and just hide.
So what would even prompt this to happen?
Because
what was going on?
An easy mark. He was an easy mark. And obviously, again, showmanship. The contortions that Krupa would go through obviously must have been drug-induced. So the public was already trying to believe a bunch of idiotic crap. And this was even before reefer madness. So, we all know what those horrible drugs will do.
Right, right.
So, yeah, they were very clever about it. Remember who was running the FBI?
Hoover, right? This is still right.
J. Edgar. This is a young, ambitious J. Edgar. They picked him as a scapegoat. He was an easy target, and unfortunately,
but to what end? I mean, I still don't understand. Is it to destroy a career? Is it to get him out of the scene completely?
They weren't really concerned about his career or him. They were concerned about making a big show of being tough on drugs and why not go for one of the most famous people, one of the most prominent artists in the country, who everybody's already inclined to believe is a pothead and a heroin addict, and just let him have it and set it up. And they did that. They planted some pot on one of Gene's bathrobes, or they referred to it as a dressing gown, set up a young guy named John Patekos as his new valet to go in, pull this stuff out of this dressing gown and get caught. And then told this guy Patekos to disappear, paid him some money. I mean, anyway, the details are out there. The fact is, it's a proven frame-up job. Unfortunately, Gene paid handsomely for it.
Talking monetarily?
Monetarily and emotionally. Mm-hmm. And bless his heart, Benny Goodman was the one when Gene came back home in 43. He said, hey, come on up to the house and play some music. And Gene didn't want to. He was going to teach, maybe write some things, practice timpani. And Benny convinced him to do it. And that's what started Gene's career back up, with the help of playing gigs with Benny's band and then moving from there, because Benny was on his way out to the West Coast where all this horrible drug crap had happened in San Francisco. And Gene said, I don't think I want to go back out there right now. So he moved from Benny's band to Tommy Dorsey, because Tommy said, hey, you need to get back in there and I'm going to do it for you.
So it sounds like the people in the industry were still supporting him. And
absolutely.
Did they believe him?
Yeah.
That he was innocent?
Sure. Yeah, certainly. There was nothing they could do, though. There were people who tried to publicly support his innocence at the time.
But they would have been vilified too, right? I mean,
I mean,
They would have been caught right up in it,
welcome to the pre-McCarthy era, right?
right?
So yeah, I mean, there were plenty of people who were utterly disgusted by what was happening because they stood back, they watched it, they couldn't do anything.
Was he married at the time?
He was.
Any kids?
Married? No children, because he was not physically able to father children, much to his lasting sadness, because he loved kids. Yeah, his first wife was Ethel McGuire, and he married her before he started with Benny, because he was making plenty of money. He was quite comfortable and figured, well, okay, it's time to settle down. So they did. And Eddie Condon tells a wonderful anecdote about him getting evicted from his apartment in New York, nowhere to go. I think it was him and Jimmy McPartland. And he says, I know who to call. And he calls up Gene. And Gene says, don't say another word. Just come on over. I'll get the couch set up. It was Gene's wedding night.
Oh,
Yeah, well, that was the kind of guy Gene was. That's a story that Eddie Condon used to tell. Who knows if it's actually really true or not? It wouldn't surprise me. But sure, he had a lot of support from his peers. And like Benny and Dorsey, there were plenty of guys out there who said, if there's anything I can do for you, let me know.
well, you'd said it really cut him to have to go through this. And the reason I was asking about being married is, how did it affect his wife at the time?
I don't really have any information on that. I believe that she was there for him, supportive of him. Who knows? I mean, based on what I read later, descriptions of Ethel, I could envision her standing there in the kitchen going, Gene, just go to Benny's house and play. It'll do you some good. She seemed like that kind of person, but of course I don't know for sure. And
did he seem, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Did he seem like a changed musician or changed drummer after this experience, or was he still
musically? No, he was true to what he felt. As a person, most definitely. Gene had a very strong faith. He grew up Catholic. He was actually, his mother wanted him to be a priest and sent him to seminary school for a year, which he gave it a good try, but drums win. It strengthened his faith to a massive degree. And I would guess that probably was one of the greatest things he had to help him going. Because you remember, it wasn't just the debt or the cost at the time, but that cost continued to come up his entire life. In the 50s, 40s and 50s, late 40s, he would hire young guys that would get busted. And the narcs would ask him where they got it. And they would immediately say, Gene Krupa gave it to me, which was, of course, a lie. But he had to suffer through that kind of stuff for the rest of his career. Suffer through idiots in the audience screaming out, yeah, you want a joint, Gene? And it still happens today. I am constantly fielding people saying, yeah, well, we know he was a drug addict. Ignorance lasts forever.
Well, again, it's the drama that people are after, right? If there's nothing there, it's like, okay, what do we talk about? Well, it sounds like there's still plenty to talk about. He's a great musician, right?
Well, again, a lot of this stuff is not known. I mean, it's one of the beautiful things about Ricky's books. There are things about Louis Armstrong that are in those books that nobody knew before, or only a few people knew it. And all of a sudden, here it is as part of the entire history of the guy. Same thing with Gene. Most people don't care, to be honest with you. Most people are really not that interested in Gene's real history. Well, it ain't going to stop me.
Well, I find this completely fascinating. This should be a major motion picture, right? This about his life.
Yeah, that was another disaster, but we can talk about that one some other time. The quote Gene Krupa story in Europe, it was so bad they had to change the title.
Oh,
they called it Drum Crazy. It had nothing at all to do with Gene or his history. But it was Hollywood again, taking artistic license, and we'll just use this guy's name, whatever.
So, okay, 43, he gets busted. He gets out later that year. He's with Benny and Dorsey. So then from that point till his death in 72, what's his contribution? What's his output?
Well, Dorsey and Benny gave him the confidence back that he needed. And by the same year, 44, he decided to start a new band. He loved so much what Artie Shaw and Tommy Dorsey did with the string section. So his first idea was to add a string section, and it would be the band that swings with strings. Well, it was, and it didn't.
Yes.
And everybody wanted just to see the old kind of band back. When in doing that, what he brought in was this new wave of young guys like Don Fagerquist and Charlie Kennedy and his partner in musical crime for a long time, Charlie Ventura, my favorite tenor player, favorite sax player. I love everything he played. And they were often running with an entirely new book and an entirely new sound, and it was great. To the point where Gene actually had a relief drummer there who turned out to be a dear friend, Joe Dale, who wound up marrying his lead singer, Carolyn Gray, in Gene's house. But it was a big deal. He was back on track, and he was just roaring along. And he did that until the big band business just fell apart, because the record industry had decided to go after the next bunch of deep pockets buyers and start promoting things like doo-wop and Elvis Presley, and just sort of left the jazz musicians and the band leaders somewhere to rot. So Gene finally gave up. As hard as he tried, he finally gave up in 51. And luckily there was Norman Granz and Jazz at the Philharmonic. And that kept Gene on the map. It wound up his solo and small group career, logged hundreds and hundreds, thousands of miles for Gene that he never would have done otherwise. Gene took the very first jazz trio to Japan in 1952, after the war, first American music over there after the war. And he played everywhere, Sweden, UK, France, you name it. So all of a sudden he was a star put together with a whole bunch of other individual stars. Okay, Norman Granz was some referred to him as a carny operator, but he knew what he had. When you've got a bandstand that is Roy Eldridge, Flip Phillips, Willie Smith, pianos, Oscar Peterson, well, you've got personnel put together in bands like that, and you've got Ella Fitzgerald up there singing. You've got a musical output that's going to fill a house. So he knew it, and he did a beautiful job with it, with all of his faults. So that's what Gene did, and he was, from then on, he was a star, and he was freelancing, and he played that way, recorded a lot, put a big band together, which included Roy and Anita in 56, and did the Drummer Man album, where they played basically the first arrangements that Quincy Jones ever put together of earlier hits, like, Drumming Man itself. And pretty much, kept playing until he physically couldn't do it anymore.
So was he ever in Vegas?
Oh, sure. Yeah. He played a lot, mostly with his quartet. They played, let's see, the Last Frontier was a nightclub in Vegas. As a matter of fact, he used to go to a particular bar in Vegas, and he and the bartender got to be good friends. And the bartender at one point said, geez, if you ever got any drums you don't want anymore, I'd love to have a Gene Krupa drum. A year later, a 26-inch bass drum shows up on this guy's doorstep. And he kept that as an end table for all his life, and his daughter inherited it, and then got in touch with a good friend of mine who was in New York at that time, who sold vintage drums, and said, are you interested in this? And of course, Bill said, yeah. got the drum, called me up, said, "Can you authenticate this for me?" We did lots of little detailed things. Sure enough, this was the last 26-inch bass drum that Gene used. And before 48 and other details that are in the book. It now lives in Australia with a wonderful guy, Andy. His last name is a bear to pronounce, Andy Prisnowski, who has bought a lot of Gene's stuff that's been around. So yeah, he was in Vegas. He sent that bass drum, and how much he was there, my good friend Paul Testa would probably be able to tell you more. I don't know the dates and times. That's where my historian chops really fall miserably down, is remembering details like that. Ask me what kind of T-rods are on the bass drum, I'll tell you. But
So tell me about some of the opportunities you got to hear him live.
only heard him once. I was young and stupid. And I spent the entire night sitting on the platform right underneath his mounted tom-tom, but in a position that all he'd have to do is go like that, and he could look at me and smile. And I'll never forget that. He would do that. He came to our table. It was my father, his father, my grandfather, and me. 3 generations. Gene remarked on the microphone how great it was. He got 3 generations of the same family come to see him. I walked over to his table early in the evening during an intermission. When he was sitting there, he was actually sitting alone. And I said, because I was a stupid kid, "Can I have your autograph, please?" "Oh, sure, of course. Sit down." And I walked back. I've got his autograph. My father says, "You ought to look at it." And there's a line from his table to the end of the room. And I'm like, oh no, what have I done? That was my experience in person with Gene. And, speaking of great tragedies, there was a professional photographer friend of my father's there that night. Took roll after roll of pictures. None of them were saved of me and Gene together. Pictures of my father and Gene sitting together, all of the ones with me somehow disappeared. Oh, well. Anyway, that was my one time of actually meeting him, but I feel like I've known him my entire life. I mean,
yeah. Well, if you're going to choose to write about somebody, I mean, obviously you had a profound effect on you.
Stick to what you know, I guess.
Yeah.
Because I'm also a pretty prolific collector of Slingerland Radio King and Slingerland drums, and I use them all the time, exactly like what Gene had. I think I'm coming from a position of knowledge. I mean, I remember Warren, good grief, name just went right out of my head. Trumpet player, Warren
Looning.
No, actually, it's a jazz trumpet player.
Oh.
I'll think of it. Holy cow. Anyway, he was all excited because he found I don't know where he found it, duplicate model of a Selmer trumpet like what Louis had. And this was the biggest deal in the world because it was exactly the same horn that Louis used. And I remember we were playing a gig in New Jersey, and he came zooming into this thing and was dying to play it. And I thought, yeah, I do that all the time. I drums, what's the big deal?
Right.
Warren Deshay. And also I would recommend, Warren's a tremendous player, great musician, funny guy.
Oh, still alive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how much he's playing anymore, but his brother Alan plays clarinet. I've worked with both of them. Warren was involved in a film years ago called The Gig. It's a beautiful film about a regional jazz band and their problems on tour. What's his name? Who was the guy who played in Blazing Saddles, played the sheriff?
Oh, I know you're talking about, but I'm horrible at recalling names like that.
In this movie, The Gig, he plays a black bass player playing with a white old guy, fat guy, Dixieland band. It's just a beautiful movie. Warren's in it. Anyway, so yeah, I know the equipment. I know what it sounds like, what it feels like, what went into building it, etc., and the history of the company itself.
Yeah. Well, uh, you think about his career and what he had done, what he contributed. Were there new techniques, new things? I mean, you had said he even introduced some rhythms. Maybe that, but as a trumpet player, I'm thinking, I don't know how to think like a drummer. It's like, what? Yeah, and maybe that's a good thing. But
Well, it's an interesting question because, yeah, he did. There were things that Gene, as I said, Gene was a sponge of anything percussion, anything drumming. And that included listening to cylinder recordings of an expedition to the Belgian Congo, recording African traditional drumming. You can run a direct line from that research to Sing, Sing, Sing. But not if you want to get into the details of that particular piece, you got to listen to every take that Gene played, every outtake that Gene may have played on the earlier versions of it when he was still with Benny. What Gene did, probably more so than any other drummer, was he played melodically, along with doing his job, supporting, keeping a solid time, all of those things. But he also he colored in a way that no other drummers were doing. And a lot of people don't like that, of course. They just think you're just making noise and getting in their way. But hey, everybody's entitled to be involved in the conversation,
Right.
And he was talking about the same thing everybody else was in those moments, contrary to what drummers do now, where everybody's having their own individual conversation and they're all standing around with each other. They're not really talking to each other. They're just talking to themselves out loud. That's my analogy for the week.
I like it.
So yeah, there were a lot of things that Gene innovated. Different signature things that he did. He adapted the press roll styles of people like Baby Dog into his own more swinging feel. And if you listen to recordings like Who, version of Who that Gene did with his own band, and you listen to this, it's just like a freight train engine. And all it is Gene just rolling on that snare drum.
Yeah.
Which he could do forever.
Yeah.
He set precedence in drum sizes. And Gene went to a 26-inch bass drum in 1936. Everybody went to a 26-inch. Snare drums, same thing. He started, typically in those days, it was, in order for it to be the quote orchestra dance band snare, it had to be a deep one. Okay, well, the philosophy of deeper being louder really didn't apply. By 40, Gene said, okay, I'm going for a skinnier one. So when he was with Benny, he used both. But he also came up with the idea of a proportionate drum setup. When the Goodman Trio Quartet started, Gene put together a smaller drum set. Made perfect sense. Hadn't been done. And so, yeah, many things like that.
Yeah.
Technical things sometimes. I mean, there were things Gene could do that physically you don't believe possible. You look at the film clip in Hollywood Hotel of the quartet doing a number, and look at the speed, the individual single stroke arm motion of Gene in the ride out chorus of that. It's just mind boggling. In the same way as watching Buddy and his hands do stuff that's just not supposed to physically happen.
Right.
But there he is doing it. Well, Gene had that remarkable power, and used it well. So,
Well, this has been fascinating. I honestly, I told you right up front, I don't know a whole lot about drums. I know names, I can identify, even by look, probably, I could tell you who's who, but, no, this has been fascinating. Yeah. You mentioned Sing, Sing, Sing. Was it him that premiered that? I can't remember.
Benny did.
Oh, it was Benny.
Yeah. And the quintessential version of that is the 1938 Carnegie Hall concert version. Much is built from that. They recorded it and played it live prior to that.
But Gene was on the drums at that time.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was him.
It was indeed him, yeah. From the beginning until who knows when the next time Benny played that thing. Gene played it his entire life. I mean, that's all a lot of people wanted to hear.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's still a crowd favorite.
Yeah, I know.
And you know what? And I hear it played way too fast sometimes.
Yeah. Well, again, this is a conversation I had interesting with my dear friend Jerry Brennan, who is another. I mean, if you think I'm passionate about Gene Krupa, you ought to talk to Jerry. Jerry's over in the UK. There were any number of versions of tunes that Benny did where their studio recording set a precedent that when they played it at a different tempo live would bug people.
Well, some of those recordings, they only had a certain amount of time, right?
Right.
So they had to bump the tempos up.
Yeah.
A tune on one side.
Well, bear in mind that this particular recorded version of that tune didn't actually appear in the public until the 50s.
Oh.
It was, the masters were not used. Benny actually forgot he'd recorded it. You want to learn about that concert, read a marvelous book done by John Hancock. It's just called the Benny Goodman 1938 Carnegie Hall Concert. His research on that is just phenomenal. And he talks about, I mean, there are many more masters out there than people realize.
Yeah.
He actually has a master that nobody else has, which really, truly, contrary to what Phil Schaap says, really, truly has the full concert on it.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm afraid he may have lost it to Sony, but who knows?
But it's still there. Somebody has it though.
Yeah. Somebody has it and nobody's heard it. Except my friend Jerry, because he lives in the UK and he had sitting there listening to it in John Hancock's living room. So, yeah, that's all Gene, all the way. And everything that anybody did with that tune, well, it's actually 2 songs that the Goodman band, in playing it, put together. It starts off with Fats Waller's Christopher Columbus. Dum, 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 dum. That's Christopher Columbus. Then it goes into Sing, Sing, Sing by Louis.
Okay.
With Louis Prima apparently never forgave Benny for that, but he sure made a lot of money off of him. It's just that, to me, it's frustrating. Gene, bless his heart, happily played that anytime somebody asked for it. 1966 on the Dean Martin show, he's playing Sing, Sing, Sing with strange silhouetted dancers behind it. Kind of scary stuff, but okay, it's 66. There were so many other things that Gene did that should have gotten the same prominence that that particular tune did. Who is another one, but Lover, the commercially released version of Lover that Gene's band did, just marvelous.
Yeah.
It is, of course, at, tempo di terras, it is screaming. And many a drummer has fallen down dead trying to match the tempo, including yours truly.
Yeah.
It's just great. And Gene's is just smooth as silk all the way through.
Yeah.
So lots of other things. Stuff that he did with the quartet, the trio, that should have gotten the same attention. Maybe in 100 years, some wacko like me will do it. I don't know. But it may be that long before I get this book done.
Yeah. Well, are you close?
Oh yeah, I'm nearly finished. And unfortunately, the software that was recommended to me turned out to be junk. And I just now recently decided to shift to InDesign, which means I had to train myself to use InDesign. And there ain't no crash courses out there that really train you to do that stuff, but the results have been 100% better than what I had before. So I'm basically rebuilding the book with different software.
Do you have a publication date in mind?
Not yet. No, I've only recently actually managed to find an interested publisher.
Yeah.
And thank goodness it's a big one.
Good.
And thank goodness they're set up to do ebooks because I've also, one of the provisos is I want to be able to update this thing. The great definitive volumes of Benny Goodman's history were done by Russ Connor. I don't want to be in Russ Connor's position where I have to publish yet the 6th volume just to fix the mistakes that I made in volume 2.
Right.
But in an electronic book like that, they told me, sure, you want to make corrections, make addition, you do them, put it together, send it to us, we add it to the book. That's cool.
That's very cool. Yeah. And also saves on our end, I guess for.
Right. Yeah.
And so,
well, a lot of the imagery for this thing, there are over 1,000 images in the book. And a lot of those are not going to transfer well to a print version. I'm finding out, thank goodness, that most of them in the new software do transfer better. So there are going to be people who are hardcore. I want a book that I can hold in my hand. I have to just figure out how to make that work. But
yeah.
And there's something important about, having that real book that you can, hold up and show your parents.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, it's like I've got,
there you go.
I've got these back here.
Right.
Well, I've got the other one on the other side of me over here, but, and Ricky was kind enough to autograph one for me. And actually,
Ricky's
Doc and Lewis were good friends. And so I made sure Doc didn't have a copy. And I told Ricky, I said, okay, give me a copy and autograph to Doc Severance. And he was thrilled. So
really?
I sent that to Doc a couple of weeks ago and was told that he had a near religious experience when he got it. So
great.
And I, I'm thinking, man, I'd like to talk to Doc and find out what he knows about Gene and his perspective on things. So
I'm sure he knows a fair amount.
Yeah.
But it would probably be the later Gene.
Yeah.
As with many of them, of course, but there are a few people out there who still are living that knew Gene, but there aren't many.
Yeah.
I've been particularly lucky with finding people who knew him, who were involved in his life in some way, who are still coherent enough to actually, answer questions.
Well, see, I think that's why this is important. What you're doing is important for his legacy.
Well,
and well, even me talking to you is helping broaden that base, that so that people are aware of who he was and what he was.
On the acknowledgement page, the list of guys that I peppered with questions over and over again, that list of those names is longer than any of the other acknowledgement lists, and they're all dead. So it's one of those things where it needs to be done soon.
Yeah.
Right. So,
well, Brooks, this has been a lot of fun.
My pleasure, man.
Did it go better than you thought it would? I mean, you were thinking it was only going to be trumpet player.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is I was all too happy to just talk about trumpet. What little I know, not being a trumpet player, but having worked with trumpet players for decades, perspectives, and there are a few names I'd love to pass along to you.
Yes, please.
That maybe you can talk to them because they're great players that no one's ever going to know about otherwise.
Man, your expertise, your knowledge, your passion for this it's incredible. It's nice to talk to somebody who is also so willing to share it.
Well, I'm glad I didn't come across like a bonehead.
No, not at all. Not at all. So, well, thank you for your time today. And
thank you.
I really appreciate it. Glad we could make this work.
Me too.
So, all right.
Okay.
Well, please stay healthy.
You too.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll run into each other at some point.
Well, if we're allowed to run, yeah.
Right. Or ever leave our house again. So,
right.
All right. Brooks, thanks again. All right.
Thank you.
Take care, man.